Well, welcome. My name is Don Gibson, and I want to welcome you to this, the last of our ethics panels here at Massey College. And as we begin, I'd like to share with you the land claim. Massey College is built on land where many Indigenous peoples have lived. It is on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee peoples. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward the land and the great privilege that we have to work on this land. Well, I want to welcome those of you who are here with us today. Thank you for coming. And also those who are joining us online at this point, and those who will join us in the days and weeks to come as they pick this up on the YouTube channel. So welcome. It's really pleased to have you. Our topic is legislating homelessness. Before I introduce the topic, I want to introduce our panel. And I'm really pleased to have all of you here. Peter Biro is a lawyer, founder of Section 1. He's a senior fellow here at Massey. He's involved with the Center of Association, UBC, Constitutional Law and Legal Studies, and he's written a book on the Notwithstanding Clause and the Canadian Charter, and it's come out quite recently. And so that's something, obviously, on this topic that we want to look for. I'd also like to welcome Diana Chan McNally. She's frontline community worker, I think you said for 11 years. Is that? Thank you, that's wonderful. Focus on human rights and equity issues for the homeless, co-founder and coordinator of the Ontario Coalition for Rights and Homeless People, currently with The Shift, a Canadian-based international housing rights organization. And I was saying to her, just as we were gathering, that she's actually part of the genesis of this conversation today. Back in December, I read an article in the Star about this very issue of legislating homeless encampments. And I had not made the connection to you, but I read it, and it was kicking around in my head. And then, as I said, the mayor of Toronto made a statement that she wasn't wanting to use these powers because she really didn't think it was very useful because she said people are just going to pick up and go somewhere else. So I had that in my head, and your article, and that was really the genesis of this conversation. And then when through a friend, I was looking for somebody who's really been involved on the street level, your name came up, I Googled it, saw the article, and I said, yeah, that's who wrote this. So thank you. It's really wonderful that you're able to be with us for all of those reasons. So thank you. Our third person is a junior fellow here at Massey, Megan McKinnon. She's in her first year studying law at the U of T. She's done research in the intersection of the legal system and mental health. She's been engaged in support for students facing food insecurity and mental health, and also working with court diversion assistance for people with mental health issues. Well, we're going to be discussing a proposal by Ontario's Premier to give municipalities more power to close down homeless encampments. And the Premier, in talking about that, suggested that if the courts were to raise concerns about human rights and interfere, and I want to put that in quotation marks because that was the word that he used, interfere, he'd be willing to think about the Notwithstanding Clause as a way of overriding the courts. Now, when I was thinking about this the other day, I know we're not going to talk about Trump here, but it just occurred to me with his battles with courts, what on earth it would be like if he had this Notwithstanding Clause in his back pocket. I just can't imagine it. But it seems more and more that it's in the back pocket of a number of our provincial premiers as people talking about using it or perhaps using it. So we're going to talk about legislating homelessness. So many questions. Is this type of legislation effective? Would it be a just use of the Notwithstanding Clause? Would it be at all effective? You know, the mayor's comment about moving from one place to another, I mean, the vision I had when she said that would be, it'd kind of be like that old game Whack-A-Mole, right? Where, you know, boom, up pops another one, boom, up pops another one. It's just, is it really an effective way to deal with homeless encampments? And then, are there alternate actions that we might take around homeless encampments and homelessness in general? So I'm going to turn over to our panel, and Diane, I'm going to invite you to share with us first, please. Thank you.
Okay. So to the questions you just posed, no, not effective. No, I don't think a decent or ethical way to deal with the issue of homelessness, which pervades this province as well as this country, the continent, actually. I can give a little bit of background about how I've been working in this space. So, to your point, I have been working frontline for 11 years. I still do frontline work at St. Luke's Out of the Cold. It's United Church just off of Allen Gardens. And within this space as well, what I've seen over these past 11 years is that there's been an extremely steep rise in homelessness overall in the city. But what's new as well is that it's not just concentrated in the downtown area. It's something that we see pervasive throughout the city in locations like where I'm from, where my parents live, which is Rexdale, north of Etobicoke. Typically, we have never seen people living in encampments in that space, and now it's incredibly pervasive. But even beyond our city limits, I've now been talking to municipalities across Ontario, which is the genesis, actually, of the Ontario Coalition for the Rights of Homeless People. Every municipality I've talked to of every possible size, whether it's urban, very rural, everybody is dealing with encampments. And that is absolutely a new phenomenon, which gives us pause as to what is actually going on here. And so we've seen recent numbers from the Association of Municipalities of Ontario looking at what they can gather who is homeless in this province, and it's at least 81,000 people, at least. And that would be, I would suggest, a severe undercount of who is actually experiencing homelessness in this province. So we obviously have policy in play here, which is leading to more and more people ending up outdoors, unsheltered. And so you have to look at what the province has been doing in terms of its policies that have been put in place. And I'll get to the Safer Municipalities Act, and I'll get to the Notwithstanding Clause, which is also Peter's purview. We don't have rent control over units built after 2018, November 15th, 2018. We have an LTB, which is slanted very much to the side of landlords and doesn't offer justice for tenants. We have an affordability crisis and rents that are across the province unilaterally extremely high and far higher than one, social assistance, which would be OW, ODSP, but also seniors are finding themselves unable to afford rents, and also for low-income earners, people who are precariously employed, people who are earning minimum wage. It simply is not an environment in which you can afford to maintain your housing. It's not sustainable. And so we're seeing that more and more people it's every kind of person, is ending up homeless. And I think there's this very stereotypical idea of a homeless person, which is always an older man out on the street, not doing well, possibly, usually, in people's minds, someone who uses drugs. And the reality of homelessness is that you can't tell who is homeless. Again, it is every kind of person, every age bracket, every gender, every ethnicity, every background. People also of different socioeconomic backgrounds. And I've encountered people who have been real estate agents, who are currently real estate agents, and that the great irony of that, ultimately, the financialization of land, and yet you can't afford your own housing. A human rights lawyer I've actually met out on the street. He was homeless for a very long time. And so it is not a typical kind of person. And so you have to look again at why this is happening, and it really all boils down to affordability and the unaffordability of housing, and also the lack of accessible, affordable, decent, appropriate housing for everyone who needs it. We've seen with the Ford government an utter failure on the housing portfolio. In the past year, February 2024 to February 2025, housing starts are down 36%, right? And a housing start, I'll get into this, it's not even a house you can live in, it's we started the process of creating a home. And even with those housing starts, even though they're falling, the ones that are out there, they're not even getting built. So we have this huge influx of people into the province for economic reasons. We have a lot of people who've always been here, and yet we failed on housing for such a long time in this province, but also nationally, because we cut our housing program nationally in the 1990s. We're in a situation now where we're so far behind to create the kinds of housing that people need, that they can access, that they can sustain, that are healthy and decent for them, that people have no alternative except to just be in encampments and out on the street. It's not even necessarily feasible to find someone to room with or crash with. It's just not easy to find any kind of accessible housing, informal or formal, for folks. And we also don't have shelter. So, when I look at the environment that we're in and I see a government that's saying people who are in public and they are homeless, that's a criminal act, I have to look at you and say, what are you doing about it to actually solve the real issue and build that housing and make it actually accessible for people? They're failing miserably. And instead of taking ownership and responsibility for those policy failures, they are doubling down on criminalizing people who are victims of that bad policy. So, you know, legislating homelessness, is it ethical? I would suggest it's wildly unethical. And I'll pause and I'll leave it to someone else to speak.
I won't claim to be an expert, as these two individuals are, but I did have previous work and volunteer experience at the Canadian Mental Health Association, where I did work with some homeless populations. And preparing for this panel, I actually talked to some of my old colleagues to get kind of their perspectives, and we kind of all came to the same collective viewpoint on this legislation and this issue, which echoes a lot of the points you made, that it's very punitive and it does nothing to actually address the problem of homelessness. I mean, these individuals will still be displaced and in desperate need of access to resources. And this type of legislation does nothing to alleviate the problem. I mean, it just limits the resources, which are already very limited to this population to begin with. And it also reinforces marginalization and just misconceptions about the populations of homeless individuals, that they are dangerous or they're not deserving of our support, which is just not true at all. And it's very dangerous to have this kind of legislation out there. I also think beyond that, it also creates problems for broader society. I mean, when you tear down encampments, it causes these individuals to become desperate for warmth and shelter, and they can cause them to break into other abandoned buildings or simply move their encampments to other locations. And I saw that when I was working in Sault Ste. Marie, and I mean, that just kind of redistributes the problem as opposed to actually addressing it. We need solutions that actually work to improving access to resources and services that will actually improve the living situation and their survivalship of these populations. I mean, living on the streets is very dangerous, and the conditions they're exposed to, especially in Ontario winters, are horrendous. And I think legislation that doesn't actually address that does nothing to actually improve the situation for these individuals. I mean, the financial aspects we also have to think about. I mean, it's not exactly inexpensive to tear down encampments and deal with it in this type of way, and it'd be much more, I think, cost-effective for governments to work towards improving access to services as opposed to just pushing issues of homelessness, mental health, and addictions just out of the public's view. That's how this legislation is kind of fixed and addressed in this way. I think, as you mentioned, like affordable housing is a huge thing we need. Individuals who are homelessness, you're usually living on like ODSP, and all the shelter and accommodation they can afford is quite literally these tents and these shelters and these encampments, and that's it. And then you have to think about the cost of when these individuals are living in these encampments or shelters that are maybe unsafe or just living on the streets. It costs a lot more money to pay for these individuals to be in hospitals when their health eventually deteriorates. And so I think affordable housing would be a much more kind of appropriate way to deal with it. We also need accessible housing. A lot of housing requires references or deposits, and these just create unnecessary barriers for individuals who can't produce those things. We need low barrier shelters as well that prioritizes security and safety of the individual as opposed to sobriety, for example. It allows a little more of an autonomous approach for these individuals to approach their problems and address them as opposed to just leaving them out on the streets when they're not able to address any of these issues at all because they're in such desperate situations. I think we need to be able to meet people where they're at. That involves like integrating resources such as housing and community outreach services, such as what you do, in areas that are accessible to the individuals who actually need to access them. I mean, I think we can do that by kind of incorporating the viewpoints of more individuals who are community outreach workers as well as those with lived experiences. I mean, we should be talking to the people who are being directly affected by the policy. They have valuable insights and they're gonna know what's most effective and what would actually make a difference in their lives. We need to actually address the problem of homelessness so that whatever solution we're putting out there isn't just gonna lead to them ending up back on the street. That does nothing for anybody. I mean, government should not be criminalizing these vulnerable populations. They have a duty to support and protect them and kind of uplift justice and equity in society, and this legislation I just think doesn't work towards that at all.
Peter, please.
Okay, you've now heard from the two heroes in the story, the public interest advocates, community workers, policy wonks, and they're the ones doing the important work. I have the unfortunate responsibility of representing the law, which is the piece of this story that represents institutional failure and civil society failure. I would argue that homelessness doesn't have any kind of constitutional status in this country. I would argue more specifically that the right to be housed is not a constitutionally protected right. I think that's true in the United States as well. I won't sort of cite chapter and verse the cases. I can. I'm happy to talk to you about the cases specifically. There's one case in Ontario from January 2023. It's the Regional Municipality of Waterloo case, which made a little bit of progress. I'll just tell you a bit about that. But I want to go back to the sort of the high-level position, which is that homelessness per se isn't really legally recognized as anything. It's a kind of amalgam of, you know, a multitude of complex problems and conditions, and there is, by definition, no homogeneity, right? And what it means to be unhoused or what it means to be homeless. There's no uniform sort of set of causes. There's so many different circumstances that if one is to try to get to the essence of the thing, to be able to figure out where it fits into the kind of legal architecture of, you know, of our civil society, it'd be a very, very difficult thing to do. In 2014, the town of Jaja case was one effort, and you probably know that case, and I think you were probably involved with that case, right? Okay, well, I would have, sorry. I don't need those glasses right now. That was one case in which advocates for the homeless and actually homeless individuals went to court to seek standing for their homelessness and to call on the government of Ontario and of Canada to actually take action to recognize their right to be housed and to solve the homelessness problem. Needless to say, the court, it was actually a 2-1 decision, decided that homelessness doesn't get that kind of constitutional protection, and that in any case you cannot force the government to take action. Now, generally speaking, when you look at the Charter, and I'll come to the notwithstanding clause, but the kind of logic of the Charter is predicated on the idea that the fundamental freedoms and the rights that are protected in the Charter are freedoms that cannot be infringed. They don't confer on anybody, and there are some exceptions, and there's the Chahui case out of Quebec, which is a healthcare case, and we can talk about that later if you like. As a general rule, they do not confer on citizens the right to demand that government take positive action of any kind, that confer benefits, enact laws, build institutions. Again, there are all kinds of exceptions to this, and it's, so just take my generalization with a bit of a grain of salt. But as a general principle, you go to court saying my right has been infringed by something the government has done, recognize that and make them stop doing it, and give me some relief for my injury. You can't go to court to say, put a roof over my head. In the Regional Municipality of Waterloo case, it was a case where a municipal bylaw had been passed pursuant to the jurisdiction conferred on the city by the Municipal Act, right, which is provincial jurisdiction, Section 92(8) of the Constitution Act. And that municipal bylaw essentially empowered the municipality to take steps to remove people from their encampments, take them off the streets, to penalize them in various ways for being where they were. And a whole host of people, including, of course, the unhoused in question, went to court and said, my charter rights have been infringed. Which charter rights? The most fundamental of all, life, liberty, and security of the person, Section 7. They also argued that their Section 15(1) rights, their right to equality under the charter, was also being infringed. That argument failed. Again, I don't have time right now to talk about it. I can talk to you about what equality rights mean in this context and why more than one court has said equality rights don't apply to homeless people. Okay? It has to do with homelessness not being recognized as an immutable, all right, or unchangeable state of affairs. Diana might argue with that position. But the Section 7 argument is extremely important, and some inroads were made, because when you look at sort of the elements of homelessness, and the two of you are much more expert on this, on the substance of that than I am, you see that it breaks down into different components. What does it mean to be, to be on the street? What does it mean to be penalized or be in peril of being prosecuted? What does it mean to be removed from an encampment? What implications does that have for your health, for your security, for your psychological well-being, for a whole host of reasons? So the court in that particular case recognized that all three of the rights in Section 7, life, liberty, and security of the person, three distinct and discrete rights, were infringed. But the question wasn't whether there was an infringement alone. The question was whether the infringement ultimately is justified, is imposed in a way that's consistent with the principles of fundamental justice. Again, I'm not going to go into what that means here. But what did the court decide? It didn't just say, okay, anytime the government takes you off the street, your rights are violated. No, it said very specifically that when the number of homeless persons exceeds the number of available, accessible shelter beds, all right, in that circumstance, there's a rights infringement, all right? In other words, if there are enough shelter beds, the court would have said no Section 7 infringement. Let me just quickly, I know I've gone over the time you wanted, get to the notwithstanding clause. So the notwithstanding clause, Section 33 of the Charter, is this provision. Tom Axworthy, who's here, was there when it was drafted. He was a party to the negotiations and the drafting of this thing. Is a provision in the Charter of Rights that essentially allows, under all kinds of conditions, which I'm not going to go into now, it allows a government to protect a law, to allow a law to operate that would otherwise not operate because it infringes one or more of certain identified rights and freedoms, Section 2 and Section 7 to 15. Again, we can talk about that later. It allows that law to be saved, even though there may be an infringement, all right? So it's called a notwithstanding clause. It says the law, which infringes a right, shall operate notwithstanding the infringement. That's the gist of it, okay? It has not yet been used in the context of homelessness, but Ford, as Diana and Don mentioned earlier, has threatened, if not promised, to use it. And he invited the mayors of the cities, various cities in Ontario, to write to him and to please explicitly say that they want him to enact a law that effectively allows the removal from encampments, and they want it to be subject to a notwithstanding clause invocation. They want it to be protected. He hasn't done it yet, and he may or may not get to that point. But here's the real question. Is there... Now, the use of the notwithstanding clause has become normalized in Canada. It's no longer an exceptional thing. It's happening in Quebec all the time. It's happened in Ontario 3 times already. There may be more. There will be more coming. It's a tool in the constitutional toolbox. The question, from my standpoint, is really about policy and politics when we're talking about homelessness and the use of the notwithstanding clause. It's people like Megan and Diana who are going to be doing the real heavy lifting here. The public interest advocacy work and the work of persuading our democratically elected legislators, members of the legislature, to enact the laws that they think are appropriate to protect the homeless in all the ways that needs to happen. Legally speaking, there is absolutely nothing. We can raise ethical questions, but there is absolutely nothing that prevents a government from invoking the notwithstanding clause, no matter how egregious. And I know we've got Noah Mendelsohn-Aviv here, former general counsel of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, who's made a very compelling argument, a public interest campaign, to say that certain super duper egregious use of the notwithstanding clause shouldn't be allowed at all. I don't disagree with that. But as the law stands, it can be as egregious as you like. There's nothing that precludes a government from invoking the notwithstanding clause so long as the formal requirements of Section 33 are met. So the big ethical question is not going to happen in the courts. It's going to happen in the legislatures. It's going to happen in the community centers. It's going to happen in the public square. I'll just stop with that and let the discussion proceed.
Well, thank all of you. I thought we'd maybe just spend a little bit of time and give each of you just maybe a minute or two just to further comment or even pick up on something anyone else has said on the panel. So we'll go back, Diane, if you have any.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly argued at certain points that using the notwithstanding clause to undermine the rights that the Charter protects seems like an egregious abuse. And yet, to your point, it is both normalized in the public, but also, again, there's no mechanism that prevents that usage. So you're right, I don't think this is going to be something that's won in the courts. And I've also made the argument as well that, you know, if you're homeless, there's no one more equity seeking, and you should have Section 15 protection as a result. But to your point, it is immutable. So it isn't something that to date has fallen under that jurisdiction. I always, you know, I think about Canada, I'm like, everyone needs to read a little Isaiah Berlin and then maybe just recognize the difference between positive and negative rights. And we're very good at recognizing negative rights in this country and very bad, very poor at recognizing positive rights. And this is where, even when we do make wins, we see a lot of barriers. So when I think about the Waterloo case, for example, what did we win? The right to remain in a parking lot in a tent. That's what we won. And we considered that a win. And that is such a low bar for us to be seeking. And it does have positive implications in the work that I'm doing. But ultimately, you think about that, and it's sad. I'm saddened that that's as far as we have been able to get so far. And that legislation does have purview in Ontario. It has standing throughout the country. But I've seen at least, in how the Premier is handling this, is that I actually don't think that he will use the notwithstanding clause. What we've seen already is that he's rolled out funding for social services related to encampments that are contingent on you clearing an encampment in order to access. My worry is that this will be normalized in how we distribute homelessness service funding throughout the province, where, you know, I feel like these, you know, we're talking about these 15 mayors who approached the Premier and said, we need the notwithstanding clause to get rid of these encampments in our communities. I feel like there's a little bit of backdoor dealing going on here, where if you play ball with the Premier, and again, this is just me speculating about the political background or context of this. If you play ball, you might get more funding for whatever it is you need to eliminate encampments in your immediate community, the political borders of your municipality, but then it might become someone else's burden if we push people beyond that. I worry that those who play ball will receive funding and those who do not won't. And if you make the human rights argument that it is always problematic to remove an encampment by force or by coercion, we will find a workaround for that. So we've already seen this happen. That was the encampment funding. It was $75.5 million that was distributed in December. I don't know when the legislature reopens going forward if this will become the case for all homelessness funding. Sure, we'll fund your shelter, but only if you will receive the money on the contingency that you also eliminate encampments. And that would completely, you wouldn't need the notwithstanding clause in that space for that reason. I don't know. I mean, that is my speculation about how this is going to move forward, which is also unethical, obviously. But I think it's a really, really real threat and something that I'm very much paying attention to as we move forward.
I think, from what I understand, this legislation is meant to be used, the government's kind of putting it under the ruse that it's for the public safety and we're doing this for the public. However, I was actually living in Waterloo at the time of that case, and the public was not quiet about what was being done to the population. I mean, it didn't align with their morals, it didn't align with their values, and there was outcry from it. And I think that has to do with, like, it is infringing greatly on charter rights, and we saw that, and I was able to see it kind of unfold in front of me as I was going to school. And I think on a certain level that should maybe, I know it's not in a great way, but signal to the government in a way that the public doesn't really want these measures. And we saw it with other policy legislations regarding the possibility of limiting the public's ability to hand out food to homeless populations. I mean, that was a huge public outcry. People do not want these populations' rights infringed, regardless of if they think that encampments are taking over their city or however they may have their personal views of it. It just doesn't align well, and I think government needs to take that into consideration when they are coming up with solutions, and I think they should consider that going forward instead of continuing along with this approach, because clearly the public does not align with it. And if they're doing these for the benefit of the public and the safety of the public, there needs to be more of a kind of overlap between that, in my opinion.
Peter.
Well, you know, that question of what the public's tolerance is a very, very interesting one. The case that I mentioned, an American case, it's Grants Pass out of Oregon. That was a case where the public wasn't so happy about what was going on, and they were quite happy for law enforcement to come in and remove people, penalize them, even put some of them in jail. And ultimately, the court in that particular case said that that was not cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, but you know, your point is well taken. I also agree with you, Diana, that Ford certainly does not want to use the notwithstanding clause, all right? But he's prepared to use it. He's proven to us that he's prepared to do that. In December, the Ontario government introduced the Safer Municipalities Act, which is step one, all right? It's essentially saying to the municipalities, go and do what you want to do. If a court rules against you, then I'm going to bring in the notwithstanding clause. So he's already done step one. The only other comment I would just want to make as a general sort of proposition, law in general and human rights law in particular is not always the most adequate way to explain what's going on in the world, to account for the problems in the world, and to provide or offer justice. It's a very rough instrument, and I would say that this is one of those situations for which law, with respect to which law fares very, very poorly in general as a kind of response to the problem, no matter where you are, no matter what side of the issue you're on. Whether you're, and bear in mind, by the way, that I said the Charter doesn't protect homelessness, or certainly doesn't recognize it as a right. The Charter also doesn't recognize property rights. And it doesn't, in general, recognize social and economic rights. They're not in the Charter, right? Doesn't mean that they're not part of our culture, of our legal culture, more broadly, of our political culture. International law recognizes the right to be housed. And the Canadian government in 2019, with the National Housing Strategy Act, recognized that the right to be housed is a right, but that's not constitutionally enshrined. And it's also not at all clear how the government would ever give effect to that right in the real world. Because the government is always, the same government that passed that is going to resist very, very vigorously any effort to compel them to build houses, more houses than they want to build, more houses than they think they can afford to build, or to do anything else, to put a roof over people's head. Anyway, I'll stop with that.
Well, I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit. The other piece that fortunately did not end up seeing the light of day was a municipality, not Toronto, that was considering how to deal with homelessness, and actually considered a bylaw that would have made it some kind of a bylaw infraction if you were to offer food and feed people on the street. Now, there was a fair bit of conversation, and they backed off. But in the midst of that, I was thinking, I worked in a church for a lot of years in Bloor West Village, where we had a community meal. And through that meal, I came to know a lot of the housed but urban poor, and a lot of the people who are on Bloor Street who are homeless. And when I'd walk Bloor Street, I knew so many people. I would stop and chat. And if it was nothing, I'd buy a cup of coffee for somebody. Buying a cup of coffee is not the solution. But the picture in my head was that, that man or woman who, in the uniform, who's ticketing the cars that are parked illegally, is now going to hand me a ticket for handing out a cup of coffee. I mean, it was absurd. But it's really kind of a way in to say, we've been talking about the government, and a couple of you have alluded to this. What needs to be done at a basic personal level? I mean, like what can we do in terms of the issue of homelessness and homeless encampments? So, Megan, do you want to take?
Yeah, I think on a personal level, we can't be expected to make broad, huge legislative changes like the government, but I think at a simple, most basic level, just becoming more educated and aware of the issues is a huge stepping stone. I mean, when I first started at CMHA, I wasn't completely aware of all the systemic issues that surrounded homelessness and all of the social determinants of health that influence these people's health to get them to this stage in their life. And I think just taking the time to understand the issue and to learn a little bit about it within your community is huge, because then you can become a little more passionate about it, raise awareness, tell your friends. Even just simple acts like that brings the issue more into light, which is what we need. We don't need it pushed to the side, which is what some of the legislation tends to do, and just see like we can move it and pretend the issue doesn't actually exist. I think even just addressing misconceptions or any misinformation about it. I mean, a lot of people who don't even think they're biased or don't think they have any negative views still see a homeless individual or an unhoused individual and may think, why don't they just get a job? That's a common comment I hear, but there's just so many systemic issues that make that such a difficult task for that individual. And I think just taking the time to really understand the issue of homelessness and understand that there's so many overlapping needs that these individuals have to have addressed, whether that be their health, whether that be employment situations, economic, and the housing situation in general. It's not an easy problem that needs to be addressed, and I think just learning and taking the time to understand that is something we can all do on a personal level, just a little bit of compassion and a little bit of understanding, and hopefully slowly we'll move in the right direction collectively as a unit from that personal level.
Okay, thank you. Diana.
I always encourage people to think at a systems level as opposed to at the level of the individual. And when I translate that to the question that you're asking, there's always this pervasive idea of just like the moral failure that someone has committed in their life, where they've now ended up on the streets as a result of that, without actually seeing all of the systemic levers that have led to that situation occurring. You know, I think to your point, like, people do have a lot of prejudice that they're not always aware of, and it doesn't necessarily take the lens of being a bigot, but there are a lot of preconceptions that people have about who is homeless and why that is, and it almost always boils down to some kind of individual or moral failure that they believe is implicit to that person that has created the situation that they're in. And so I'm always trying to get people to humanize homeless folks, to see them as whole people, whatever that looks like. And it's often just having very individual conversations with people about, you know, kind of exploring what those prejudices look like and what they are, and then trying to connect it to, again, those systemic levers that have created the climate for mass homelessness that we now see in Ontario. But it's really difficult because it's so deeply entrenched in us that we almost universally, even, you know, very decent people that I talk to, conflate mental health, homelessness, and addiction as being the same issue when they are absolutely not. They are not. And honestly, if people are living with mental health barriers, if they're using substances, it's usually as a result of the extreme trauma that you experience being homeless 24/7. I don't think people really understand what that means unless you've been there. I try to relate to people by asking them, have you ever been locked out of your house, even just for an evening? What was that like for you? How did you feel from just that very short period of time being in this situation where you could not access your things, safe shelter, etc.? And that is just an inkling into what it is actually like. It is relentless trauma, and we cannot expect people to not seek out coping mechanisms as a result of that. And because there's so few available to people, because we don't make trauma counseling a core part of wraparound services that you always hear about in shelter settings, it's always about not using a substance as opposed to dealing with the underlying trauma of things. It's just nuts to me that you would even have that expectation of people at all. Your health, your physical health, your emotional health will decline. That is part and parcel of being homeless, and it is through no fault of your own. It is because of the conditions that you are thrust in. So to understand that at that level, to understand the systems level, as opposed to whatever somebody did, and from a human rights lens, that shouldn't matter, doesn't matter. Your behaviors, your actions don't impact your human rights. But to get people to start thinking about that, I think is really important. So I try and prod a little bit about this stuff, but it's really a high mountain, unfortunately, for us to be climbing up I'm just trying to do my best, but I also encourage others to start to do that work as well.
Peter.
Well, I'm not an expert in this, so I'm not even going to purport to answer that question sort of directly. I will say I think that, you know, the law, as I said earlier, is more of the problem than of the solution at this point. One of the things I would like to see is decriminalization. And when I use that term, I'm not speaking in terms of the criminal code or, you know, behavior that we literally think of as criminal behavior, but just the notion that you would condemn certain types of behavior. I mean, Pierre Poilievre wants to remove safe injection sites from the face of the earth, okay? That's a huge problem, and that bears directly on the discussion we're having today. There's all kinds of ways in which behaviors and activities and inclinations of people, for a whole host of complex reasons, get criminalized in one way or another. If there's one thing the law should do is get the hell out of the way and figure out how to be helpful and work with experts like Diana and others to figure out how you really address it, how you really make a difference. But, you know, we've got public morality, we've got community standards, we've got a whole host of issues that get in the way here. The one thing that we shouldn't try to do, and I would say this with respect to my friends who are the public interest advocates, on behalf of, you know, of sort of doing more for the unhoused, don't try to make the law say what it can't say. Don't try to make the charter say what it doesn't say. That's going to backfire, and that will ultimately, you know, be more counterproductive than anything for a whole host of reasons. I mean, the right's not there. It's not there in the charter. Don't make the charter speak. And, you know, of course, activists have always sort of resorted to the courts, and since 1982, sort of gone to the courts with the charter in hand, and, you know, with the assumption that the charter will solve every problem, every social problem, and every human rights problem. And it doesn't. It wasn't designed to.
Interesting, the idea about the law getting out of the way. Just a wonderful little story. A number of years ago, I was working with an African congregation, and they were all new Canadians, and their teenagers, all new to the country, were beginning to see homelessness, and they were quite troubled by it. So they thought that they'd like to try to tackle this problem, and so their solution was to cook, and to cook African food, and on a Saturday afternoon to head downtown in a van and just start feeding people on the street. I mean, it was a wonderful initiative, right? Well, they're set up about 5 minutes, and along come the police because they don't have a permit. So, you know, it's a whole new world of trying to figure out how you take that desire to help people and work through the system. Now, it was really quite fun because these kids were sharp enough to feed the police. And they said, fine, you know, continue today. And here's what you need to do to do this in the future. But I was always intrigued by just their ingeniousness and their determination. But running up against even a little thing like a municipal bylaw when you want to try to help people. So that's quite an interesting kind of piece. I want to come back to the question of the legal question, and it seems to me, and I'm just going to look for your opinion on this, that there's an element in some of this suggested legislation of kind of out of sight, out of mind. I'm a Montrealer, and when Mayor Drapeau was having the Expo in '67 and the Olympics in 1976, he didn't want people to see those unseemly parts of the city. And so he solved it in '67 in part by tearing down a huge amount of the inner city and building an elevated expressway for cars. And the rest of the city didn't want seen. He hid behind great big fences. Did the same in '76. His critics used to suggest that his idea of urban development was out of sight, out of mind. And is that what the government's up to? Are they just simply trying to appear to be doing something and then we'll go along our merry way and not think about it? Megan?
Can I just I'll
Sure,
take a quick
please.
shot, and then you can get into it in more
Sure.
depth, the two of you. But, yes and no. Sometimes it is the case. I mean, it's much easier to clean up the streets. sound like a fascist when you use that term, clean up, you know, get rid of the mess, the ugliness, out of sight, out of mind. At the same time, there are genuine conflicting interests here. I mean, when we talk about the unhoused and we talk about the homelessness problem, we shouldn't speak, you know, with complete disregard for the interests and the attitudes of homeowners, right? Shopkeepers, school children on their way to school. I mean, we live in, you know, we should be taking a whole of community and a whole of society approach to this. Let's not forget, you know, what happened in Ottawa not too long ago with the truckers. I mean, a lot of people in Ottawa who care a great deal about human rights and civil liberties were up in arms, not with, not with the government's response, and certainly not with the invocation of the Emergencies Act, but with the disruption and the nuisance to their streets. Now, not for a moment am I equating the condition of, you know, homelessness and, you know, the disruption that occurs with encampments, you know, to what was going on the streets of Ottawa during the trucker protests. But it's a perfect reminder that we're dealing with complex problems and conflicting and competing interests in society. So, you know, when you talk about cleaning up the streets, presumably there's someone who thinks they're benefiting from that, right? Cleaning up the streets, obviously not the right way to speak about it, and it's not the right thing to do. But one should not be naive about the fact that there are competing and legitimate competing interests at stake, right? And all of these cases, you know, put those competing interests in evidence. It's not just a one-sided thing. It's not that, you know, encampments are being removed because people, you know, because governments hate homeless people. I mean, some of them do. And, you know, that's the reason why I said we need to decriminalize the state of homelessness in every possible way. Destigmatize, but more importantly, decriminalize it. It shouldn't have a legal status. But let's not forget there are competing interests. That's what NIMBYism is all about, right? Not in my backyard, not on my street, not in my neighborhood. And there's safety and security and cleanliness and hygiene issues and noise issues and public nuisance issues. These are all legitimate, you know, competing interests, societal interests.
I think sometimes governments will exacerbate those situations to have an excuse essentially to remove encampments by not providing things like sanitation, by limiting resources. And we've seen that in the city of Toronto in the past. But to, you know, your comment about out of sight, out of mind, and we just mentioned the Safer Municipalities Act, which was not passed. No. But Ford has promised when he returns to the legislature, that is the first piece of legislation he intends to pass, which is modeled somewhat on some of the grants passed somewhat. And it's also fully criminalizing public homelessness. That is embedded in the act. It's discrimination on the basis of housing status and full criminalization of somebody in an encampment. There will be a new Section 15 argument we can make. But it's devastating legislation if it actually comes into being. It allows for the immediate removal of an encampment on the basis of presuming that that person is using drugs or might have drugs inside the encampment without the burden of proof, which is a far lower bar than the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. You don't need to prove that someone has drugs. You can just say that I believe you do. And that gives you grounds to either remove the encampment immediately, to ask somebody to move along, or there's two remedies that are embedded in the act if it's, again, tabled as is. One is that you can be arrested and sent to jail. That can be for up to 6 months. There also is a $10,000 fine, and you could also have both. $10,000 fine, which is a far steeper fine than, again, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, as well as 6 months of jail, just for being in public and being visibly homeless, again, because perhaps you might have drugs. The other remedy, if none of those are taken, someone doesn't leave, but they're not complying, you don't arrest them, you can now scoop somebody, according to the act, and drop them off at a social service agency. and then they become the burden of that agency who may not have resources available to support somebody. And my fear as somebody who works in a social service agency is that they will then be targeted by community members who are not aligned with homeless folks, and possibly we could see a reduction in services, or like we've seen in South Riverdale, for example, a lobby against some of those services if they become depots essentially for homeless folks. So the legislation, as I said, is devastating and very much about allowing the immediate removal of people under pretty high threat of, again, jail, a fine, or again, just being dumped anywhere. That's very much about out of sight, out of mind. And as I said, I worry that this will be weaponized differently in different municipalities. And so we might see Barrie, who had the bylaw, or tried to enact the bylaw about not giving food to people in public. Alex Nuttall, this mayor is very much anti-homeless. I can see him taking this act and fully implementing it as it's writ, and then pushing people outside of the limits of Barrie proper. But Aurelia, and they have the same service manager, they're part of the same region. I bring this up because the service manager, which takes care of Barrie and it takes care of Aurelia, they provide the homelessness services to both. So that's interesting. So it might cause some disruption there, but as to say, Aurelia actually passed a motion to not use the notwithstanding clause against homeless encampments, to not criminalize people based on their housing status. So you're going to have a very interesting situation. I think possibly if this legislation goes forward and then we see again with these different service managers, these different municipalities, it could play out in very strange ways. And I don't really know what that looks like right now. But again, it's something that I'm paying attention to.
We just have a few minutes left, and I think we have a mic, and I'm wondering if there's any of you in our audience would like to ask a question. Anybody have a question for the panel in general or one of the panelists? Yeah, okay.
Thanks. One of the things that came to my mind when you asked, like, what can you do at an individual level? I'm thinking, like, write to your councillors or MPs or MPPs. If someone were to do this, what should they be asking for specifically?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that one right now.
Okay.
Again, the notwithstanding clause, it's still a lingering threat in the background, but it's not directly on the table at this moment. But with Ford, again, suggesting that he is going to bring back this piece of legislation first thing in April, I think it's important to write to your MPPs, your MP as well, and your city councilor, your mayor, to reject this idea. I do think that most people, even if they're not like cool and chill with encampments being in their neighborhoods, they get that housing is the solution. I've had conversations with people I'm not, ideologically very aligned with, but we come to the same conclusion that it just makes sense. You want to end homelessness? Build some housing. That makes sense. So I think regardless of who you're talking to, and they may be on side or not, you can have conversations that kind of arrive at that and then push forward, I think, to political leaders to say, we don't want to just whack-a-mole people from park to park, ravine to ravine, municipality to municipality. We want that housing, and that rests primarily with the province. So to really, I think, demand it of the Ford government, because we're stuck with another Ford government, that's what I might suggest.
Any other questions? Yeah, right.
Thank you for this amazing panel. It's so important, the work that you're doing. I'm wondering whether the coalition has put together some draft letters that people can use and rely on.
No, but we should. That is something that's absolutely on our radar. I think we just had a federal election called. We know what the writ has been drawn. We're distracted in many directions at the moment, but absolutely, I think that's something that we're considering as well. And there's many organizations also working in this space, and so I'm looking at ways that we can also just coalesce all of our efforts and put forward a unified front instead of having it piecemeal. This person releases a letter, this organization co-signs this. I feel like there has to be a unified front, and we can try to help organize that with other organizations as well. So no, but wait for it.
Did you want to go ahead?
Thanks. So in this very interesting discussion, you just said something in the last moment, that if there's a homeless problem, let's build some more housing. Now others have argued that governments find it very hard to build housing, and it's complicated, but they find it far more easier to support incomes. That you can do that through the tax system, you can do that through checks, you can do that and provide more income for those who can't afford housing. So my question is, and this is a very large issue, but is that not a large part of perhaps solving the homeless if we looked at poverty around income? Or is there particular issues about the homeless beyond the income issue?
It is absolutely part and parcel, I think, of the issue, especially if we look at social assistance, OW and ODSP. If you're on OW, you have $343 a month to put toward your lodging. Show me anywhere in the past 20 years where you can afford a place in Ontario for $343. It's just simply not possible. So if we're looking at income, absolutely with income programs, the minimum wage, I'm not an economics guy. We'll put it that way. I'm also not a housing policy wonk, but as to say, yes, I would agree with you that income is a key issue that also underlies why we're seeing so much homelessness, which is also why, you know, under the threat of tariffs, it's interesting to me that Ford would continue on this line of we should be criminalizing homeless people when you are facing possibly a large cohort of people who may lose their employ. So looking at income security and benefits, I think would be really important. We do have something called the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit. I have very mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, it's a neoliberal solution to a neoliberal problem, which essentially takes government money and as the person who's low income, you're the middleman, and you funnel it to your landlord because your landlord is not being incapacitated in their outright greed. That's the situation that we live in. I have very particular politics about this, obviously. It does exist, and it actually, for all my criticisms, it is one of the few ways that we are moving people out of the shelter system or from encampments and into sustainable housing. So even though I don't like it as a permanent solution, as an interim solution, it's quite effective. So it's not an income support, but it is a benefit specific to housing. And it is a program that I think could be, for now, expanded until we get to a point that we have the supply of accessible, decent, affordable housing available to people and better rent controls as well.
I'm going to just quickly follow up because this is my not knowing anymore, but there was a time in my experience when if you didn't have an address, which homeless people don't, the government was unable to deliver services to you. And I don't know if that's changed, and if it hasn't changed, then how would the government be able even to help you with income if you don't have an address? So am I off base? Is it changed, or do you still have to have an address to talk to the government? It's not entirely changed. A lot of social service agencies, we will function as the permanent mailing address. Annie is here. Annie is on the board of All Saints Toronto at Dundas and Sherbourne, and so a lot of people use All Saints as their permanent address for checks, all kinds of different things, identification as well. So it's something that, it's kind of an off-the-books policy thing that we all do. Everywhere seems to do it, but you would only really know that if you're kind of embedded in working frontline. So you're not wrong, it's just we found a little bit of a secret workaround. So there's an interesting possibility for community organizations to expand that availability around address. Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, we're at the end of our time. There's so many questions, and this conversation could just go on and on and on. One of the things that intrigued me that we just touched on was kind of that threshold question of, where can you and where is it feasible to use the notwithstanding clause around human rights, and where is it absolutely not? But we're obviously run out of time. That's a conversation I'd love to have in the future. But I want to thank all three of you. This has been a really wonderful conversation, and I think it's given us a lot to think about. Appreciate your time and your energy and your willingness to be a part of this. Thank you very much. And for you for being with us. Thank you. Thank you.